What is your reaction to Kellyanne Conway, right? This is an anonymous source. This is a senior advisor to the president saying that Ford should be heard, she should have a chance to speak, and everyone should stop insulting her.
I mean, if that's true and that actually is the Trump White House's position, then that's great. But she says a lot of things that aren't necessarily followed up with any action. I'm not confident that this White House actually does believe that this woman should have the chance to speak. That said, if that is actually the White House position, then great. And I hope Republican senators take that on board and that they let Dr. Ford testify.
Evan, explain the calculation, not just inside the White House, but inside the administration. Because if you're Mitch McConnell and you're focused on the midterms and you're this close to getting a nominee through, what do you do?
Well, right now, the calculation politically is we need to ram this through as hard and fast as possible. The vote is scheduled for Thursday to come out of committee, and they're saying that we can have Dr. Ford testify tomorrow. That means Wednesday we do the quick rebuttals, and then Thursday we ram it through on party lines.
Let's pick different words than ram, hard, and fast, given what we're talking here.
But from a perspective of the longer this goes and is discussed, the worse it is for Brett Kavanaugh. And the more I've looked at this situation, at first, when I first heard about these allegations and it was anonymous, I felt this was another thing that Democrats were doing to try and derail it. We watched the confirmation hearings be a theater of the absurd, with Kamala Harris and Cory Booker beclowning themselves. But then when I read that Washington Post interview, I started to really think about this differently and said, okay, there's something here. And I don't know what happened on that night, but I know in the reaction that's going on right now that for the integrity of the court, as well as any of its future rulings, Brett Kavanaugh cannot sit on the Supreme Court. I think we need to withdraw his nomination, which is sad for me because I was an enthusiastic supporter. And we need to actually have somebody who's a conservative who will not have these types of allegations trailing them.
But why does it have to be that black and white? You know, I looked at Matt Miller on Twitter earlier saying you either believe Ford or you believe Kavanaugh. Does it have to be that black and white? Can't you simply say this is one of the most important appointments in our government, in our country? Let's just put a pause on it and hear, because if he is as great a judge, as great of a character as he says he is, then this will play itself out. Why not say, let's listen to this a moment?
I agree, and I would just disagree with saying that Kamala and Cory clown themselves. But here's the thing. We have to examine and vet this. It's not a question of, as you said, black and white. Her coming forward, we need to hear all the details of what she has to say. He has a right to respond. But by the same token, he hasn't been appointed to animal control. He's been appointed to be on the Supreme Court for a lifetime. And this, to me, is very similar to the evidence that Sheldon Whitehouse and others were trying to get from him on the issue of gambling. You see, because if this type of thing happens, and let's say it's a one-time incident, well, what stopped it? What's going to prevent you from doing it again? Did you get any type of therapy, Mr. Kavanaugh? I mean, so it's not black and white at all. It is just that complicated. And I'm not saying this to plug my other job, but you know how many calls I got this morning on the radio before I came over here from women victims and therapists? And this should disabuse people of the notion about women keeping this a secret and waiting to hold it to announce it at a time like this. There is something about this type of experience, and I learned about this morning, that makes it difficult for you to talk about it. Her coming out 20 or 30 years later is characteristic of this type of experience. Women called and said, I had a therapist say this, and people can Google this if they want to learn about this today. But the instinct or the bodily chemicals that animals have to kind of put things aside and move on to the next thing, even
how
when they're
women forget what childbirth is like.
Right.
Yes.
Human beings don't have that. And it can take the smallest thing. A woman called and told me she heard a song on the radio that reminded her of what had happened, and it triggered her coming out and talking about it. We are in the Me Too era. These matters are being litigated. You cannot be a judge who's going to hear these matters potentially, or oversee matters that will have been heard, that will be appealed, that will go to the Supreme Court, and you have a conflict of interest when you've done the very same thing and been so dismissive of it.
Hold on, I want to bring Jill in.
He must withdraw.
We are in the Me Too era, but if you look at Twitter, for example, when a woman comes forward, if it's 10, 20, 30 years later, even if it's immediately after, the absolute character assassination she goes through and how brave you you have to be to do such? Casey mentioned it earlier, but I want to bring it back. I want to play what Susan Collins told CNN about these allegations just last night. Please listen.
I obviously was very surprised, and it's an issue that I brought up with him last Friday, and he denied, as he did in his written statement. That's really all I have to say at this point.
Do you believe the accuser?
I don't know enough to make a judgment at this point.
Okay, she doesn't know enough to make a judgment. She could know more, and I need to remind our audience, she knew enough to tell Al Franken to step down. Jill,
Amen.
All senators are under pressure, but what position does this put Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski in?
I mean, they're obviously in a very difficult position. As the two kind of more moderate members of the party, they are accountable to constituencies that do want them to be pro-woman, that do want them to not be these kind of far-right, typical misogynists. They're also women, and, I think that this is unfair. I think we should expect that male senators are just as accountable to women as female senators are. But the reality is that Collins and Murkowski are being held to a slightly different standard because of their gender. So Collins is right. Maybe she doesn't know enough. And so give the woman the opportunity to testify. Give senators the opportunity to ask her questions and to be able to fully assess and vet this nominee. This has been a remarkably opaque process. Kavanaugh has not been a particularly transparent nominee to the court. And this is one more example of one of those skeletons that, frankly, I wish it had come forward earlier. But now that we know, the senators do have an absolute obligation to the American people to make sure that